Um, well, thank you for, we grabbed a few new folks who are interested in intergenerationality. What we're going to do today in about an hour's time is I'm going to give you just a little introduction about what intergenerational formation is. It's not something that a lot of folks are familiar with. It is something that has sort of grown in the last 10 to 15 years. And there are reasons for that, and I'll go over that. And so what I'm going to do is today, this is a Bible study, and we are looking at the biblical scriptures that undergird this argument. But I want to give you just enough to whet your appetite for what the basic argument is. And if it's something that you're interested in, let me know after, and then next week I'll do more of a full-blown explanation of why we are and get into the generational theory behind that. For those of you who don't know, my background is entirely in youth ministry, or not entirely, largely in youth and young adult spirituality. My undergraduate was in adolescent sociology, and my MDiv was focused on young adults, and my PhD is in practical theology, and I was funded to study youth and young adult spirituality. So what's happening in the youth culture is something that's very near and dear to my heart, both because I contributed to it for the better part of 2 decades. And then while studying it for the PhD, I became to a point, thank you, Silas. You know, take one, and if you want one, pass it.
I'm going to wait on
You wait on that?
Do
you want to pass the plate?
Oh, yeah, maybe. Yeah, pass it. Go for it. You do what you need to do.
You want
Nothing can distract us.
I'm going to pass.
Yeah, me too.
No, but it was something that as I was studying about how to fix youth ministry, and the reason I say that is I started my PhD in 2006, and at that time they had just released a study that was done by a researcher out of the University of North Carolina. He's now in Notre Dame. His name is Christian Smith. And it was the largest study of young adult or youth and young adult spirituality in the history of culture. And it's the longest as well. It was started a little before 2000. And in 2000, they did quantitative and qualitative research, starting with about a pool of about 6,000 young people, and then shrunk it down to about 500, I think, by the end. And basically since 2000 until the present day, 22, they are following these cohorts of young people, examining so basically it sheds light on millennial spirituality. But what they uncovered was a number of interesting facets about youth culture, and the overshadowing sort of dilemma was in the late 90s, we had a large sort of movement towards leaving the church. Now, if I want to back this up, just to and this is the sort of nutshell version I'm going to give you, and if this is something that you want to dig in deeper to, we can do it next week. But if you look back at and really, next week we'd look back from the beginning of the church, because there's different eras of the church that have led us to this place where we're sort of facing this. If you look back at the last 5 generations, I don't know how much you're familiar are with generational theory. It's Strauss and Howe were the two sort of sociologists in the late 1970s, early 1980s who put some of this together. But what they did is they thought that what if we went back and we characterized certain generational cycles? And so 18 years to 22 years is a generation. And so every around 80 years, you have a generational cycle. And what they did, dating back to really around the 1400s, is they traced these 20-year to 22-year segments throughout the history. And what they saw was that every 4 generations, things started to repeat themselves. And there were cycles that they understood. And part of that is always a reaction to the previous generation. You know, the boomers reacted to the silent generation, and so on and so forth. And so what we get throughout the history of generational theory is reactions to different generations. But we're not going to look at beyond the silent generation. So just to categorize it briefly or crudely, because there is more nuance in it, but generational theory would say that boomers were born 20 to 40. Xers were born 40 to 60, silent generation was born 20 to 40. Boomers were born 40 to 60. Xers were born 60s to 80s. And the millennials were born 80s to the turn of the millennia. And then the next generation is the Gen Zers, if you will. And that's just because we're the X, or I'm an X generation. The millennials rejected the Y association because they didn't want to be like in the shadow of their older grungy siblings. So but us as parents, now we're in this age so the generation D sort of stuck. And what defines a generation is the things that actually happen around their coming of age. So sometime between the ages of 15 and 25, there are events that happen in people's lives or in culture as a whole that often is what ends up labeling that generation. So if I could crassly go back and look at the last five, is the boomer or the silent generation came about, and their coming of age was during the Great Depression. And so you can imagine that how that would affect their understanding of life. And so when they matured into adults, they were it was still an era where decency and morality kind of ruled the roost. It was the same era that everyone on Sunday morning was in church, or on Saturday in a synagogue or in a mosque. I mean, like, just religion was there, but it was primarily like everyone was doing the religious thing. It was a sacred canopy covering over the whole. And there was a sense of decency. And then there were social clubs. This is where Masonic clubs and Lions clubs and Rotary clubs and churches operate on that way. You had this pastoral model, similar to what we have here, in the sense of you had one pastor for every church, and there was no associate pastors. There often wasn't a church secretary or Christian education. It was one pastor. And the reason that worked was because the community as a whole understood that it took everyone to make these things work. So some of you are shaking your head because that's the church you grew up. You volunteered for church. You went to church. It was part of your duty. Well, when the boomers came around, it was also during a time where there was a massive movement in psychological research. So you go back and you look at sociology sort of around the turn of the century, and then which studies social systems. And then Margaret Mead around the early 19 teens, ultimately publishing in 1920, basically studied the Samoans and launched this whole field of study that we now know as anthropology. And it was not just the study of society, but it was the focusing trends within cultures themselves or when people themselves. But what it did is it focused on the individual experience. And I think that set the stage as we turned that century for Piaget and Erikson and Freud and all of these psychologists who were now saying, let's stop focusing on the community and let's focus on the individual, because we realized that we were individuals in almost a new scientific way. Because if you think about the technological changes that have happened over the last 100 years, it's phenomenal in terms of our understanding of human development, psychology, the way drugs interact in the brain. I think we're good now, unless you just want to keep making them. Just make them till the back. But what happened in that is we started focusing on our own experience. And this is where you get the whole 80s, 90s, Dr. Phil and Oprah sort of talk show. Let's explore someone's personal experience. Let's hear their encounter in the world. Even Jerry Springer, as bizarre as those may be, it was a look at the psychology of the individual. Well, the boomer generation, as you know, it was the beginning of the sexual revolution, women's rights, all those sort of things, sexual revolution, so all those things have radical change, because it was like, hey, let's look at ourselves and see how we're different. And so things started to shift, and they started to shift inward. And at the same time, this baby boomer sort of movement, as you all know, because most of your boomers, it was an explosion. And society, that's why we would call it a boom. Well, this changed the church too, because all of a sudden after the war, you had this massive amount of people, this influx of folks coming in to churches, and churches that couldn't hold them. So what did they start to do? Well, they started building Christian education wings so they could accommodate the Sunday school crowd. In fact, in the Presbyterian Church alone, there's a $40 million endowment or a restricted category just for the building of Christian education buildings. That was a leftover from the and they're trying to cypre it to something else to use it for other purposes. But that shows you the investment. It was also the era that Christian educators came out, because as those booms happened, they went from the church model that originally had everyone going to Sunday school in the 1920s and 30s, and then everyone went to church. It was no drop-offs. That was what you were expected to do. Well, when the churches boomed and there were too many people, they said, Well, we can't build another church that quickly, so let's have 2 services and then we'll flip-flop them. So half will go to Sunday school while the other half are in worship, and then they'll flip and the other half will go to worship while they're in Sunday school. Well, it fragmented the church. This is also around the time that Starbucks and home coffee makers came into sort of the 50s, and this is why we had developed the coffee hour. But what happened, it's true. And then what happened was, though, in the midst of all of this, as we started to look at time and productivity and technological advancements and time is money sort of that came in through the 60s, what eventually happened is the boomer parents started just going to one thing. So they would go to church, and then they would send their kids to children's church or to Sunday school. So you know how people say these days, oh, church is for adults. It's not for, like in a lot of churches around in the US, they don't want kids in the church because it's not for them. And so they took the kids out and they said, this is an adult worship. And now all of a sudden the parents were like, I need some time myself. This is my time. This is a personal spiritual experience. And I need to be, and I don't want my kid with me. So we had nursery. And it was a time that churches were growing. And also the industry, the beginnings of youth ministry were there. Christian educators were more and more hired by churches. Associate pastors were being hired. We went from a pastoral model where one pastor governed sort of guided the whole church to a programmatic model. And we started creating programs that people then were attracted to. So it's not surprising. Many of you know the Kevin Costner film, if we build it, they will come, became the mantra of the boomer era. And so they started to build with the anticipation of people coming. This is why VBS launched into a whole new stratosphere within the church. Because all of a sudden people were like, you know what, we could have a VBS. And not that VBS wasn't in some form still exists, where the church got together at one point. But that emphasis, let's do a kids-oriented program. And if we do this, then the parents in the local community will bring their kids to it. And then the kids will be taught these songs, and they'll have such a good time. And then at the end, we'll stick them on the chancel and they'll all sing the theme song to VBS. And then the parents will come to church, be members of our church. This is the mentality that still operates today. This is why people do VBS often, because they hope that somehow connects the community to themselves. But this is that consumer-oriented church that said, we are going to do stuff that appeals to you, so you'll come to what we're doing. Well, this lasted through the 80s, and it also developed a culture of youth ministry, and it also segmented. So I was a product of that. I'm 49. I was born in 1973. I went to youth group when I was 12 years old, between the 11th and 12th. That summer is when I got to start, right after I turned 12, and carried on with youth ministry. Now, I was in a Pentecostal church, so my youth ministry was a little bit similar to what I was doing in the actual the corporate body. But in many of our youth groups, what we did was we said, okay, we're going to put the children over here, the youth over here, and we're going to give them age appropriate experiences. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's what we thought that was the best thing to do at the time. We were following the educational system that's in the public schools. Let's break people into different, age brackets. They all learn different. We're going to cater to their different learning needs. And this will be great. Everyone will feel, everyone will learn. But what happened is that we took that same model and we took the last intergenerational enterprise in our culture, the church. And we segmented it into ages and stages. Now, this may not be your experience in your church, just to be clear. I'm talking generally. And so what happened then was my generation largely grew up in youth groups. So our spirit or in children's ministry. And so I always like to joke that when millennials like to bring their coffee and their granola bars into church, and the older generation's like, that's so disrespectful. Why are they doing that? Well, we shouldn't be surprised, because we were giving them animal crackers and apple juice when they were a kid. So they were learning about Jesus while they were eating. And actually, sociological research and psychological research would say those are patterns that develop. It's not actually, it's funny, but it's true. If you're always eating while you're watching TV as a child, when you watch TV as an adult, you probably will carry on that practice, because it's something that becomes ingrained in a part of who you are. Kind of what we talked about a few weeks, I don't know, last week or whenever time last week, things are just embedded in you. So what happened, though, is we went through this programmatic model where we were trying to draw people to the church. And in the 90s, it worked gloriously. And in fact, every church says, oh, we want to go back to the good old days. They're not talking about the 50s. when the boom was there. They're talking about the 90s, when there was the evangelical church. Every church was booming in the 90s. There's just something, I don't know if it was leading up to Y2K or it's just there was a sense of sort of embrace. But the interesting thing is, the Xer generation, those of us who were born between the 60s and the 80s, who were products of this programmatic model, became disillusioned with it in our 20s. And I was in that category. I thought, man, they played games with us. They gave us Jesus. We were happy in church. We had fun. But if I look, I came from a youth group of 150 kids. And if I look back to see how many kids are serving Christ today or a Christian today, it's probably about a dozen. And that actually mirrors a lot of the same sort of retention rates that many churches have. Billy Graham had a 67% retention rate because there was an emphasis on experience and conversion, and you were always amongst your own peers over all these things. And then you went from children's ministry to junior high ministry, to senior high ministry, to college ministry. And then at 22, there was the expectation that when you graduated from college, or sometimes when you graduated from high school or confirmation, that when you went out into the world, you would just slot yourself back into the church. But what young people, I'll come to you in a second, Ben, but what young people discovered was that the practices that they grew up with in their youth and children's ministries were not the same practices that were carried on and valued and practiced and experienced in the corporate body of the church. So instead of adapting to that without those emotional connections, because all of their emotional connections had been tied to their peers in their formation, they just said, we're done. So my Ben, question.
I was just thinking, is that what drove these mega non-denominational churches with rock bands and all that stuff, and all the younger kids going to those churches instead of
it is
traditional denomination?
And for mainline churches, what we ended up doing is losing those who did have faith from mainline denominations ended up going into non-denominational settings because those settings look most like youth groups.
Exactly.
But my generation, the Xers, felt disillusioned by this. So in the late 90s, early 2000s, you have this massive push towards mysticism and historical Christianity. So I'm sure in the last 20 years, you've heard people talk about Lectio Divina. It's sort of a sacred reading of the scriptures. It comes from a monastic tradition, or labyrinths where you walk through the little paths, or Jesus prayers, or beads, or pilgrimages. All of these things were unearthed from the history of the church because my generation felt disillusioned with what we were receiving in terms of the offerings of the church. And in part, in this next week, if you're interested, we can go into this more, but in part because when you had a moral generation and the silent generation, and you had largely what I would call a therapeutic generation. If the boomers have been called a therapeutic generation because they were concerned with their own therapy of how they experienced the world. And as a consequence, the Xers, we were the first in the boom and progress of technology and society and history. We were the first generation to have 2 working parents and no grandparent in the home. I should add that. It's not because, for society, you've always had middle-aged people both working, men and women. But then the grandparents, there was no sense, the whole notion of retirement and 401ks and all of that jazz, that all came out in the last era, the last century. Prior to that, grandparents moved in with the house with their kids, or the kids moved in with the house of the parents. And then the grandparents were help raising the children while the parents were off working. This was the system until the last century. But because of that, we were the first generation. We didn't have grandparents in the home because the grandparents were in retirement communities. We had 2 working incomes, so we were the latchkey kids. We came home, we were the Scooby-Doo, come home after school, watch Scooby-Doo, microwave some Velveeta cheese, and then go terrorize the neighborhood with no oversight whatsoever. This is why Xers are helicopter parents, actually. They call us helicopter parents. Why? Because if I told you some of the stories, even as a Christian kid, that I got up to in my teen years, you might fire me. Not that you could yourself. But all that's to say is, coming back to the beginning, when they did this study in 2000, Christian Smith, the National Study of Youth and Religion, they surveyed this millennial generation, and what they found is there was a success rate of passing down faith. The worst of them were Roman Catholics. Roman Catholics did the worst job. Sorry, Jim. It's, you know, you got to rule the empire for many years. Now you're failing to pass on faith. It's going to come to an end. But the Roman Catholics did the worst, and then the mainline Protestants, so Presbyterians. So we're not. So I always like to say when I teach this stuff that we were second worst. We weren't the worst. We still have the Catholics who came in. I'm just kidding. No, but and that actually was an anomaly, and they did a whole nother study just on the Catholic transfer of faith, because the assumption going into it was that given the traditions that surround Catholicism, that those things would have transferred more easily. But what they found was the mainliners and then sort of American middle, not quite evangelical, but like American Baptist and some of the smaller denominations were sort of in the middle. And then you had the evangelical traditions, Baptists, and over, you know, down here. And then you had Pentecost. Oh, then you had the Black and Hispanic churches. So churches of people of color, they did a decent job handing down. Then you had the Pentecostals, who did a great job of handing in faith. And then you had the Mormons. They studied Mormons too. And Mormons won. They are doing the best to hand down their faith. Now, if you take these last three, ethnic, racial ethnic communities, holiness movements, Pentecostal movements, and Mormons, what you have in those is a strong collective culture. Like, you can't get out of Mormonism that easy. It's also, you know, tough sometimes to get out of Pentecostalism too. I can attest to that. And there's a cultural cohesion around racial ethnic communities, because there is an ethnic connection there that holds those things, and there's more space for some of this intergenerationality. But what they found after they did this study was that those who had grew up with theological vocabularies, so in other words, that they talked about faith growing up, that had parents who were committed and were in church and demonstrating adherence to these practices of the Christian tradition, they did well. They did, and the ones where the culture was the same, they did great. But over here, and ultimately, what they labeled this whole thing was moral therapeutic deism. In other words, the Christian Smith asserted the dominating religious perspective of millennials is called moral therapeutic deism. And that means that they look at church or religious institutions and they say they're there to give us a sense of what is right and what is wrong. They're there to help us feel better when the world gives us lemons, I guess. But God is not a personal God. God's sort of a distant God. So God doesn't care what I'm doing in my everyday life, but not the denial of who God is. Now, what's interesting about that is sexual promiscuity among millennials is skyrocketed. And when you have a God that you don't feel like is judging you and is far away, and an institutional church that you've abandoned that gives you your morals, then you're left with sort of your own moral compass. I'm going to dig into that in a second. But what I want to give you, though, in that moral therapeutic deism is you have, for the first time in culture, not a total reaction to one generation in this entire generational cycle that goes back to the 1400s. You have a reaction to the last three generations. So what the millennials represent is the morality of the silent generation, that sense of decency. The church is there to put order. The church is there to tell me what's right and wrong, even if I don't agree with it. And they don't, because they have an internal sort of authoritative, self-authenticating authoritative sort of system. But then they look at the boomer generation and they say, well, church is here to make me feel better about myself. Well, that's the therapy of the boomer generation. And then that sense of deism, that God is far off, well, that's a sense that they draw that from their older siblings, the extra generation. And the concept behind that is that we were the generation that didn't feel close to God, so we sought those more mystical, deeper ways. We wanted the mystery because it was so programmatic and consumeristic that we wanted something rich or deeper. So our generation dug into the history of the church. So what you have in the millennials is you have the influence of the silent generation through the decency, morality. You have the influence of the boomer generation and the therapy, and you have the deistic tendencies of the extra generation that got wrapped into the entire millennial generation. As a consequence, they have felt the disconnection from the institutional church, in large part because they came into an era where anyone could be anything. And so they could, it's called a bricolage self or a patchwork self. And the concept behind that is, instead of taking the traditional way someone is socialized into a community. Now, if you think like a little German community or a little Amish community or a little Oklahoman community, Not in the modern day context we are, because I think we've lost that sense. But originally it was when you were born. Peter Berger, if you're sociology folks, who died a few years ago, but he was a great Austrian sociologist that came and lived in the U.S., had this theory that our primary socialization comes from our relationship with our mom. So let's just, you can be my mom. So I'm born, you're the first person whose eyes I look into, I develop an emotional connection. Your cosmology, your views of the world, that's what I believe. Silas, he doesn't have his own thoughts. I mean, he does have his own, trust me, he has his own thoughts. But his cosmology comes from us as his parent, those who he has emotional attachment to. And then that primary socialization extends out in concentric circles. So then you have grandma and grandpa, or brother and sister. And, you know, they believe that, okay. And Berger uses the example of slurping soup. You know, mom saying to you, don't slurp soup. Oh, okay, I don't want to, I'm not going to slurp my soup as a 4-year-old because it's going to upset mom. Well, then you see dad's like, don't slurp soup. Okay, dad doesn't like it either. Big brother, oh, don't do that because you'll get in trouble for that. Oh, and so they develop maxims. And the idea behind this is you're developing an anchor identity for who you are. And if it's in it, and then the church would be this next context out of that. And in a church and a society where everyone held the same belief system and participated in the same practices, it forms you as an individual as you grow up as a child, which is why many from your generation remain in the church, and why your people from your generation want sacred hymns, because that's the music it's the only music you had growing up. And so that became part of that sense of formation. But these millennials, they have the ability for the first time in culture not to just take one thing. Because of technology, they can get onto Facebook and one night they can change their entire, it started with My Face. I don't know if you remember My Face. It was the first time you had an online presence where you could change the color and put your own photos up and put little icons up, and it was like an expression of yourself. Well, we live in it, and you go back to the 80s, think, how many of you know this movie, The Breakfast Club? It's stereotype. You have a jock, you have a nerd, you have the princess, you have these stereotypes that you fit in, and the millennial generation had that shattered for them. Those norms were broken, but not because they grew up in a time where they didn't have a sense of self. They actually grew up in a sense of time where they didn't have an anchored identity. Because they had grew up with parents in different places, they were put in maybe in daycare, and then they were put in preschool. And so they were constantly being moved around to a different place and having to learn different rules from a very, very young age, instead of having that given to them by their nuclear family. So that's primary socialization. It's called an anchor identity, and it defines who we are. The challenge of this is the secondary socialization that happens. And that's sort of, if you could think, if you have your primary anchored identity, and the secondary phase of that is you have these other ideas that come into play. Now, if you have an anchored identity, then you can say, well, you're saying this, but what do I believe? What have I been told is true? Where are my emotional connections? And you're like, so you adjudicate other worldviews based on who you are. But the millennials were not raised with a sense of an anchored identity. They were raised in a culture that said you could be whoever you want. You can shape your persona the way other people perceive you by simply changing the color of things. You have kids that go to school day when wearing black lipstick and goth stuff one day, and then next week they have on preppy clothes, and the next week they're sporty. How can they do that? Because they have patched themselves together by taking bits of culture from here and there. And they've been given this opportunity of globalization where all the internet, all this information is coming in through their phones and their computers. So they have access to stuff that we never had access to. You had to go like dig into the library if you wanted to like find out another culture, but they have all these things brought to their doorstep. So they've put themselves together. But identity social theorists would say that your identity can never actually fully be formed if you lack an anchor identity. And this is why the millennial generation, and it probably is a trend that is in all of us some way, because it is a sliding scale that says, I'm trying to figure out who I am.
Is this maybe why we have so many young people, 20s and younger, that have psychological issues?
Well, there's
That really struggle.
I would argue well, that's another topic unto itself.
But it sounds like that could really cause
Here's the thing is I think that teenagers had I think yes, it could cause that. Yeah, identity issues of who am I? I mean, and I have nothing but compassion for those who find themselves in gender dysphoria in our culture, the trans culture. But at the same time, I think that there were people in previous generations who felt like that, but society as a whole just sort of didn't give credence to an opportunity or a platform to even talk about that. So I don't think it's a new thing, although I would argue in some sense that the introduction of plastics in the last century have had tremendous impacts on everything in culture, from our health to cancer. I mean, now we have microplastics in our blood. So from wearing probably polyester most of our lives. So, I mean, I don't know how it got in there, but somehow we're getting it in there. Maybe it's microwave things we shouldn't, but there's all sorts of things that I think contribute to that. I mean, you have girls who start their menstrual cycles at 9, but yet can't keep a job till they're 35. So you have an early development and maturation, but you have kids. And honestly, if you look at the age of 18 in 1950s, you were considered an adult. Why? Because you were done with your primary education. You were likely in the next 3 to 5 years to get married, to have a permanent job, or to be done with your education and moving that direction. The average age for getting married right now is like 32 or something up there. And then what has happened over the years is they've pushed that sense of youth. Then it was 21, then it was 25, then it was 29. And now sociologically speaking, and in academic circles, 34, 35 is considered the end of young adulthood. And you think, Charlemagne conquered because again, and part of that's just, but you know what? You also have arrested development in adults too. How many adults act like their children or want to recover some sense of their youth and we have almost this defying of youth sense, a sort of trend in our culture as a whole. But what you had in that is you had a generation then that tried to figure out who they were, but because they weren't anchored in an identity, because they only grew up in their peer-oriented environments and were given, and spiritually speaking, were given a spiritual experience that was akin to their age. And so by the time they got to 22, 23, maybe 18, who knows, and they had the option to be a part of church, in the end, they were like, well, what's to hold on to? The good time that I had? There wasn't that sacred rhythm. So now when we think about religious convictions and how they're passed on, there's a memory theory that largely said, well, actually, before I go to that, briefly, there is a learning theory that says we actually learn by participation, by doing things. It's not just by hearing things. In other words, if you want to learn how to ride a horse, you can go buy all the equestrian books that you want. You can get all the anatomy books about horses you can. You could get some simulators and you could bounce on your sofa like you're riding a horse. But until you get your rear end in a saddle, you're not going to ever experience what it is. So that's in some sense a crude way of saying this is what we did to our young people, because we were always concerned evangelically about the newcomer in our youth groups. We never had deeper discipleship. And our young people left their high school experience having a good experience, but really never participating in the rich rhythms of the church that have sustained it for centuries. Sorry. And so as a consequence, they left. Yeah.
When you look at the youth as they try and develop their identities, but they also seem to me they want to be part of a collective. Because gang affiliations, where the gangs take place of family, is very powerful. And you look at it, they have a structure in there that's very structured. They want something that's structured, it seems like, too, in there, because they fall right into that. They get recruited and they go, they take better care of me than my family. They take better care of me than society. I'm watched out for. These guys have my back.
Well, it's a Protestant work ethic. It says kind of like when you're 18, you're on your own, you move out. You know what? So being biracial, my father's was Filipino and my mother is from a German side, white America, very individualistic. Everyone's got to make it for themselves. When you're 18, you get out. This is the sort of mindset that my mom grew up with. Whereas on my father's side in Asian culture, no, like when your child's 18, that doesn't mean they're independent. It doesn't mean they're independent when they're 28. And it's not like, oh, they're moving back into home. There's a sense of collectivity that says, It's not like I'm going to have my retirement and when you can get it when I'm done. It's a sense of how do I have the whole unit of the family thrive? We don't have that in our culture today because it largely exists in racial ethnic cultures, not in typically Caucasian white cultures. Not to say that it's not there. It's just not as a common feature. But I think that you're right. I think there is that sense of disconnect from younger generations. And what you have in non-denominational churches these days is affinity groups. Oh, you like running? Oh, we should have a Bible study for runners. Oh, you like noir films? Me too. Let's have a little, and you see it in the Bibles. I mean, like honestly, for as much as we talk about how sacred the Word of God is, do we really need a male athlete's Bible? I mean, like we're taking the holy word of God and we're just putting a lot of tchotchke in literary form in it and saying, here, let's curtail this to your specific experience. We want this to be just for you. And it's the whole idea that individual faith is the most important. Now, it is the most important thing in terms of one's salvation, but what Barth, or neo-reformed theologian, I've talked about Barth in the past, Karl Barth, who was a German theologian from the early 20th century, around the time of World War II, he said that yes, we come to Christ as an individual, but the minute we make that commitment, we cease to be an individual. We now have a responsibility to our neighbor. We have a responsibility to those who are in Christ Jesus. No longer, and everything that Christ calls us to, if we really want to look at the gospel, deny yourself, consider others better than yourself, give others the extra mile so they can hear your cloak. I mean, like the passages that Jesus was talking about was always putting the other before yourself. So when you step into a relationship with Christ, you step into a community. This is why the Presbyterian Church has such strong communal understandings of how we function in life. We don't baptize, we don't celebrate Eucharist, we don't do those on a personal levels. They're always done in community because it's a covenantal relationship. All this is to say, in the early 2000s, we noticed young people leaving the church, and some of this theory is some of the stuff that I've come up with alongside others to figure out how this is operating. And so for me, this is sort of, and I suppose about 2008, I started to get this inkling that we've done something wrong, because I was like, how do we fix youth ministry? Well, we got to fix youth ministry so that we get the youth with proper. Oh, well, in children's ministry, how do we fix? They're saying, oh, well, the parents need to do something, but they need to fix the home. And so it goes along this whole way, and you're always trying to fix something. Well, perhaps what we don't need to do is fix an age and stage ministry. We need to fix the entirety of the way we express ourselves as a church. So now, when you think about identity formation and everything we've talked about, when you participate in something, you feel like you belong. So when I first started doing Cub Scouts, I don't really, and still don't like the little uniform they make you wear. I'm not really a uniform person. I don't really look that great in brown. It's the olive complexion. So, but I'll say this. So, and I remember feeling so awkward and weird. I don't know the scouts or the signs or what you do and the crisscrossing at the end. But as I did it, and as I participated as a parent, as I participated in the campouts and the events, I slowly began to feel more like a part of the community. So that concept behind that, and I'm giving you these in sort of nutshells, is the more you act, if you were to draw concentric, when I say concentric circles, I just mean like a donut, bigger and bigger. The more you participate in the practice, so each of these rings represent different levels of practice of a community. And this is not a Christian theory. This actually, it's called situated learning theory. And it goes back to actually AA is where they first actually discovered it. That when someone from AA comes in and sits down the first time, they don't want to share. They don't know where the coffee is, they don't know where the bathroom is. It's a scary experience. They just sit in the back and they listen and they just watch. Well, as they legitimately peripherally participate increasingly, well, then the next week they know where the bathroom is, so they feel like, oh, okay, I don't have to stress about that. Oh, I know where to get coffee. I know that the right side is decaf and the left side, even though they're not marked, I have that. There's a sense of connection to the process, and over time they get to the place, then they share, and then they share again, and then they become a sponsor, and then they're leading their own, and so it becomes this process of integration. So the biggest thing, and this is why this summer I'm like, time and talents. We want people to participate. Why? Because the more you participate, the more you have a sense of belonging and a sense of connection and a sense of emotional attachment to those who you journey with. But if you only show up to church on a Sunday morning, well, quite frankly, then it's a Sunday morning church, and your spirituality is checked off in a 2-hour period. as opposed to those who plug into multiple spaces during a church community during the week. They feel more connected and they feel like they belong more because of that sense of more. The more you participate, the more you belong. Now, in a general sense of why we're talking about intergenerationality, is what we're realizing is that the things that we did with young people for the last 50 years, and I'm complicit for 20 years of those things. I have done all the youth group tricks, big extravaganzas and Jesus Light and Sinner's Prayer. I've done done all of that. And so I had to reflect upon my own. I remember telling a parent in one of my first youth groups, no, you can't participate because your kid needs to experience God away from you so they can actually own their faith. What a load of, yes, I know I said that. It's a little embarrassing. But honestly, in the 90s, that's what people were doing. Parents dropped their kids off at church in the hand of some, hipster 20-year-old and hoping that their young person will see, oh, but that guy is or girl is so, cool, or they love God, or they're funny, or they're great. And they just want them to see that model. So then they'll think, oh, that's who I want to be in faith. We've all thought that, maybe not all of us, but trust me, it's a consistent thread and theme through American Christian education and youth ministry. We just need to get a cool person in to lead our young people, and then we can step back and let it go. I mean, how many churches, I can't tell you, over the years, that said, oh, we value youth ministry. They hire a youth minister, and then they say, here, go down to the basement with your horrible, nasty furniture that's all dank and stinky. And here's a $1,000 budget. And they say, take care of our youth.
Built a gymnasium too.
Or on the better end of that, built a gymnasium for them. But it's kind of like, pool tables and foosball tables and air hockey tables. What makes us think young people want those things so bad? Because we think if we put those in a room with a bunch of sofas and some cool lighting, that kids will be flocking to it. And then they're going to have this incredible experience with Jesus, and it's going to shape them for the rest of their lives. Well, it didn't happen. And where we as a church are facing extinction on many denominational levels because of this. I cannot tell you the amount of small churches like this that in the next 10 years will close their doors because COVID was the last nail in the coffin and people just aren't coming back. Now, I think we're different because we have a different dynamic and it didn't affect us in that way. But what we discovered, or what I would say that in my dissertation, I use this in a different way, but communal memory theory, a guy named Paul Connerton came up with this whole theory of memory that basically said, when you participate in practices that are bodily engaged, so that they're performative, with ritualistic tendencies that mean something, they're valued by those who participate in it, that creates communal memory. And that is sustaining. And so this is what he argues basically has sustained practices like communion. 2,000 years. 2,000 years we've been doing, and we'll do it on Sunday. 2,000 years. We're taking a cup and bread. As bizarre as that is, it shapes who we are. It tells us who we are. It is a proclamation. It's bizarre and it's weird and it's different. I mean, we're talking about what these elements are, different people believe different things about what happened to the element. But at the end of the day, no wonder they thought they were cannibals in the first century, because they're like, yeah, we're in here eating body and blood of Christ. You want to join us? No, you're sick. Get out of here. But so there's a sense of a loss. And so we are recognizing now in the Christian education ministry field for youth and young adults that the things that we've done have not worked. So we're scrambling to try to fix each of these age and stages of ministry. And this is where this whole conversation around intergenerationality emerged for me. So I started wrestling with it. And then when I met, if you were there on Sunday, and I said I got fired from a job instead of coming here in 2010, because John Bonner's wife was not well and they had to postpone the search, and I was running out of housing and I had to go somewhere. I was finishing the residency of my PhD, and I wanted to find somewhere to write. And I loved this. I'd never been to Colorado. I loved the idea of this community. I wanted to write here, but it didn't work out. So I ended up in a 4,200 member church in Seattle. I ended up, I was the 92nd pastor or 92nd person on staff and the 11th ordained pastor. I had about $1 million budget for junior and senior high. I had about 250 families. I had 6 full-time staff. It was a massive operation. They brought me in because I was this sort of, youth ministry guy coming out of Princeton Seminary, and they thought it was a perfect match. Well, it didn't go down because I did not want to do a Young Life ministry. And there's nothing wrong with Young Life. I have a great respect for what Young Life has done. But Young Life sometimes grabs kids in and they keep them in there and they never go anywhere other than Young Life. So they're doing the same ministry, isolated, peer-oriented model that everyone else is doing. And the kids don't often survive in that. Unless their parents are connected, oftentimes then that happens. But I didn't want to do that, and I was pushing, and it was actually a kid, and I wrote that. These are some resources, and you're welcome to borrow them, or I can send you copies. I wrote the foreword to this book, and in that I shared the story of being in the sanctuary with a kid from this 4,200 member church in Seattle, and saying which service that we had 5 services on Sunday. To try preaching 5 services, trust me. It's like Groundhog Day by the 4th. The last one was contemporary, so the lights were down. You get to change clothes, a little more hipsterish. So you kind of, so you had a little break there, but no. But after 5, and I said, "Which is your service is your favorite?" And he said, I've never been in the service." And I said, "Weren't you raised in this church?" And he said, "From birth." And other than sort of special holidays, because at one time was a 6,700 member church, because they developed programs, and then kids went there and the adults went to the church service, and then the kids went to their children or junior high or senior high programs, and until they were in college. And then they had the church has the largest college ministry in the denomination, about 800 students. And then they would go do their own thing, but they would. And he said, "I never went." And I said, "How could you have never been in service?" And so I sort of started on a quest that didn't end well, because I was fired after 11 months. I brought 85 junior hires into the sanctuary in the first 4 rows, and I didn't tell the senior pastor. I was a little, cocky, and thought I would stick it to him. So I brought them in out of the program. I mean, he had known we were going to come in, but what he didn't know is that I was going to stick them all in black T-shirts that said in Seattle you have HOPs, high occupancy, or no, HOVs, high occupancy vehicle. Right. And you can get in the lane if you have more than 2 people or something. So I created a shirt to say that had a picture of kids in a pew, and it said HOP, high occupancy pew. So we crammed 85 of these junior hires in there, and I got to be honest, I was happy with myself at the time, but it didn't. But I was trying to send a message to say, and it was not the best way, but long story short, I led in integrating the church. I wanted junior hires and senior hires to worship together and then to separate for teaching. That was not accepted well. Across the board, I had all these things that I was trying to integrate into a more intergenerational. I was toying with it. And in the end, they didn't like it. And they thought they wanted basically a Young Life model. And I didn't want to do that. And so I got fired. It was a dark time in my life, but I came out of that and healed in New Wilmington, Pennsylvania, in a little Amish town, and wrote my dissertation and dug deeper into it. And it was in 2012 that this book was written and published. It was called Intergenerational Christian Formation. And it has kind of to this day been the Bible of intergenerationality in the church. And I would say that the things that we were wrestling with around this concept of intergenerationality, Holly Allen and Christine Ross put into words, and it actually brought everything together in one sort of, and this has been the seminary text, the undergraduate text. A new version of this is coming out next year. For those of you who do know, I was actually one of the authors rewriting the version or updating the version for them, but we split on the issues of biblical theology. They want, and what I'm going to present to you here in like 2 minutes is what I wanted to put as the biblical chapter in the new version of this book, but it made them look like their original chapter was wrong, and it is. And so I didn't really care because I wanted to put it out there. And then so we went round and round, and eventually I had to step down from the project and break contract because I didn't want my name on a book that espoused things that I didn't believe. So, but I am writing the foreword to it, so they're going to let me still have. Oh, by the way, if you ever want to read about your generation and what they've done, this is a book for you.
Make sure Denny sees it.
Is it? Yeah, Denny, you see that? This is about you, Denny.
Yeah.
This book is dedicated to Denny Brown.
Is this from a Western Christian
yes.
problem?
It is a Western, white, largely, and I would say even more affluent problem.
Because in Asia and Africa and stuff, they still do the multi-generational homes.
They just don't have
And
youth group in
living.
the same way.
Right,
yeah.
but they still live multi-generational.
Yes,
In
yes.
their homes and in their villages
Yes.
and.
Absolutely. Yeah, Ben.
Yeah, there was in David City, Nebraska, where my brother lives, there's a Catholic church. They do not have any youth program whatsoever. They absolutely won't do it.
Yeah.
People tried to ask for it and all that. And we were there in church, made the families we and with young families with their kids, and even some teenage kids without their parents were in the church.
It's
Never
loaded with
seen
children.
any kids, so many kids in the church.
Well, honestly, my experience growing up in the Pentecostal church, we didn't have Sunday school during service. And on Wednesdays when I went to youth group, my mom was in church. And my youth group, other than the games that we played at the beginning and the food that we ate at the end, largely looked like the same thing that was happening in the main service. So I had some continuity, but in most churches that have youth ministries, it's like big program and good food and lots of games and fun and trips and this and that. And it's all great and it's capturing their attention while they're there. But as time has told, it doesn't actually, sort of confirm that sense of spirituality and in the sense of who they are.
Do churches across the country, are they recognizing this as well?
Well, this is a trend over the last 10 years. And this conversation, in 2000, sorry, I'll come to you in a second, Karen. In 2000, what are we at now? 16, we had a conference in Nashville. The author of this book brought about 200 people together, practitioners, professors, Catholic to Protestant to Unitarians, all came, it wasn't many of us. And we were sort of hashing out what's happening, why is this happening? And so all that ended up in this book here. And if you want a 15-page short run of what I just sort of shared with you, I have the first chapter in this book, and I summarize that. And this was the book that came out of the conference. But this sort of is a armchair version of going to a conference and hearing about all the things. So this was in 2016. In 2018, this was the second version. Or no, it was 2018, 2000. This would have been the second version, 2020. And this was the second version of this. The second time we gathered as a group of people, I was the keynote speaker, and I wrote about turning our fragmented communities into Sabbath communities, basically intergenerational Sabbath communities. And then I wrote a chapter on play. So if you want to borrow that, you're welcome to. And then one of the editors or one of the other groups, this is another compilation about it. And this is a international perspective. So they have writers from all over the world who are contributing. But in 2019, the May of 2019, they had 20 folks from around the world gather in Westminster. We're called the Westminster 20, and we basically developed the framework for how intergenerationality looks today, with the understanding that if things are intergenerational, they're represented by a mutuality, where both being formed, children and adults, Silas and are all being formed. They're a reciprocity, that there's a give and take. It's not just all give. It's not like me as a youth leader just giving to the young person and I'm just sort of here as a chaperone, but there's an actual exchange, some level of accommodation that we are each sacrificing a part of who we are. And unfortunately, we say, okay, well, in the youth group situation, the adults sacrificing their sense of spirituality for the sake of the young person, but we never consider the fact that children who are a part of our services sacrifice their sort of learned engagement for the way we celebrate church. Now, I would say that's a good thing. That's a good accommodation because they should learn to adapt to what's going on. But that doesn't mean that the adult congregation can't use some of the techniques or practices that happen in youth and children's ministry to bolster our own formation. And this is the challenge that we have in a church today. We don't really want to change the church. We don't want these youth ministry practices coming in, but the reality is they would make all of our experiences more formative and longer lasting. But the argument, and I recognize, what time is it? I don't want to.
3 after.
3 after. Okay. Can you go with me to 15 after, quarter after? I'm going to give you the biblical rationale for this. The funny thing is and all of the teaching for this.
We have to go.
That's all right.
We were supposed to be somewhere at 6.
That's okay.
But
But I
I'll
vote for
vote for
next
next
week.
week.
Carry on conversation. Well, if you want, I can save the biblical rationale for this week, and we just go Q&A at this point, because I'm sure that there are things that you're thinking in your head. So do you want to? Well, let me give you the nutshell of the biblical argument, and we can talk about the whole thing next week if you want to. We'll just call it the Q&A section next week. But the nutshell of intergenerationality, and if you look in this book, they argue, and this is one of the only critique I have of the book, is the fact that in the biblical section they claim that those qualities I just described for you intergenerationally were present in the Old Testament. That there was intergenerational formation happening in the Old Testament because people gathered together and God made covenants with everyone. And for me, I argue that it can't be. Because if you look at the worldview of human beings and cultures, in particular in the Middle East, women and children were viewed as property.
Still are.
And still are, and probably in some places. And so you can't have a sense of mutuality and reciprocity among men and women, let alone children. I mean, why did Abraham so quickly sacrifice his son? Because that was a common practice among many nations. If the gods gave you a special offering of a child, then you returned that child in a way that honored the gods. And so there are some that think the whole Abraham story, that it wasn't actually God saying, go sacrifice your kid. It was his own psyche that said, I should sacrifice my kid. God's still the hero of the story and rescuing, but it sort of takes off some of the trauma around a divine God that is all loving, saying, go kill your kid because I'm just going to trick you in the end. Some people don't like that. And it's an interpretation that has dominated the church, but one that I don't necessarily accept personally. But in all of this, if I were to give you the biblical rationale, it would be if you go back this is the chapter I wrote, chapter 8 that didn't get in the book. And I just printed it out because it has the verses actually listed. Genesis 1:26 says this, then God said, let us make them in our own image after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God made humans in his own image, or man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And so two things that denote: one, the plurality of God, we created. So even from the beginning, from the Hebrew scriptures, God has always had a plurality. Let us create. And that's that reference to the Spirit and to the Son of God. But what you have in this is a unique relationship, or a unique distinction for who humans are. This goes back to, do dogs go to heaven? No, not because we don't like dogs. I think they'll be in heaven, but they're not going to heaven because they don't have a soul. And so they don't have an immortal spirit about them. If we want to claim that the dogs do, then we're denying the uniqueness of the created order that God had in humanity, because God gave us God's image and likeness, which made us like God in relationality, in creativity, in rationality, in logic, in our emotional connections, in our way, in our will, in the way we respond. These are all parts of the image of God in us. So in that first relationship where you had male and female, there was a sense of mutuality. Man wasn't over woman. Woman was called a helper, but that doesn't mean that there isn't still some sense of difference. But the way that men have dominated the history of our world over women actually was a curse given by God. And if you look at Genesis 3:16, when God cursed Eve, he said, now your desire shall be for your husband, or the man, and he shall rule over you. In fact, the fact that we look back at how many thousands of years of patriarchy was not just by chance because men were stronger. It was designed that way. It was a part of our enfleshment. And when that fall happened, that mutuality and reciprocity that Adam and Eve existed in, and this beautiful relationship with God where they got to frolic in a garden. I always love saying God's original intent was to hang out with a bunch of naked vegetarians. But when that fragmentation happened, Cain and Abel were the first example of what happened out of that. One killed the other. One was against the other. So everything was broken. Now all of a sudden the concern was, how do I survive against you? Not how do I give of myself for you? And so what you have then is God's series of, and we're going to look at these over this next year, but a series of covenants that God made. First, was with Adam and Eve. Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Well, they messed that up, and then God restored that covenant with the Noahic covenant. And again, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. It still didn't go down as God planned. So God's faithfulness from Sunday still remained, and God created a new covenant with Abraham, where God said, your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sands in the sea. Your name will be great, and your house will be established forever with a land. So God made this covenant with his people. And it was made not just with the adults, but with everyone. But that dominating view that there was still this hierarchy was still there. And then you see that, and then there was Abraham, and then there was Isaac, and then there was Jacob, and then there was Joseph, and then they went to Egypt, and there was 400 years in captivity, over 418 years in captivity before Moses came along. And then they made their exodus. They went out into the wilderness. God made a covenant with Israel in the wilderness. And the sign of this covenant, the sign of the original covenant was circumcision. The sign of the Mosaic covenant was the law, was the 10 Commandments in its relationship to Sabbath. God said, now I'm going to give you, for the first time in the history of Israel, I'm going to give you a day to rest. But prior to that, there was no break. 7 days, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. You were on the clock, always ready to go. Well, God said, no, I've taken you out of your captivity. Now I'm going to give you a covenant that will give you a day that you can experience what you lost in that paradise. You see seeds of intergenerationality, of recovering what was. Davidic covenant comes along. I'll give you my love and never take it away from you. Your kingdom will be established forever. Well, you have the fall of that with like I said on Sunday, Solomon, and then Jeroboam and Rehoboam, and then a split kingdom, and then an overtaking, and an exile, and a return, and all sorts of turmoil that happened in Israel's history. And in the midst of this, you have the prophet Jeremiah, who comes and says, someday everyone will be basically responsible for their own spirituality before God. You will no longer have to tell your brother or your neighbor how to know God, because everyone will know God. So this is the promise of what was yet to come. So 400 plus years later, Christ comes on the scene. When he starts his ministry, he goes out and is ministering to people. What does he do? He hangs out with the prostitutes and the singers. He goes to the woman at the well. He befriends Mary Magdalene. He's breaking those conceptions of the relationships between men and women. What does he do with children? Let the little children come unto me. Look at this child who has the fish and loaves. Your faith has to be like a child. All of these passages that capture the seeds of him planting a new type of relationality that we lost in the fall. The Spirit comes in Pentecost, and now all of a sudden you have women in leadership, women who are involved in guiding churches, our deacons and our elders. You have young people like Eutychus and other, I don't know, there are a few other that are in there that sort of exemplify that there's a changing of a system. But for 2,000 years, we haven't seen that really affect as much as we thought we would, maybe perhaps. And as it has gone through 2,000 years, you've seen this slow evolution. Well, in the last 50 to, I guess now 70 years, they say the beginning of postmodernity started around 1950. And the postmodern era, the modern era goes from 1750s, from the beginning of the Enlightenment, till the 1950s, where postmodernity stand. And that was the scientific, rational thought, everything's proof oriented. And there were still defined maximum rules. Well, you get into the 1950s and all that breaks down. The whole system is crashing. The Christendom, the era of a society ruled by a religion that started in the 300s with Constantine, has come to a close in the 1950s. And we now are entering this era of secularization. But what we see in this, for the first time in the history of our civilization since Christ, is now we are actually saying, you know what, you're different than me, and that's okay. I can empathize with your experience, even though I don't experience the same things as you. The concept of empathy has a major movement over the last probably 30 years in terms of our understanding of relationality to one another. And I think that's why, for the first time in the history of Christian catechesis, in the last 10 to 15 years, we have this conversation of intergenerationality surfacing. Because we can look at someone and say, what does it mean to recover what we had in the garden? And again, if we start to look at our young people and our elderly people and all those in between as being as a community, journeying together on this sort of caravan of life, and God's intention, original intention, was to have us all be together. And to have that reciprocity and that mutuality and that sense of equity and inclusion of who we were, and to form and God's relationship was meant to be with us as a people. But over the last 50 years, we've fragmented that and we've separated it, and we're suffering the effects of it. And so underlying this whole argument is the idea that the Holy Spirit brought us into a new era where we now can actually begin to recover what was lost in the fall with the sense of who we are together. So we know sociologically that young people need to be experiencing the practices of the church if they're going to carry that into their future. They need to know the hymns. They need to know the songs. They need to know what communion means. They need to know, all those little parts of the church that we do, the participatory parts where we read together, reading a responsive psalm. Does that make a difference? Yes, it does. Because it says to my son that the whole community participates in this, not just him in another room. And what that means is when he is 18 or 22, that will have formed him, and the relationships that he has with all of you will be forming him. And what we have neglected over the last 50 years was forming our children in a communal understanding of practices, a practice-based faith that actually tell us that we belong. And so this has been sort of a piece of me, a passion of mine. This is what I pretty much taught for about 5 years in the national office. 90% of my teaching around the country. And if you want more of this, there are all sorts of videos online. If you type Intergenerationality in Santos, you'll find it online. And there are videos and lectures up there that you can listen to that kind of tap into the same thing from different perspectives. All right, that's the biblical rationale for why we have to all be an intergenerational church together. Yes. Karen.
Sure. Well, I've got a lot of questions.
Sorry, you just keep rolling.
How are you going to bring it about?
I think you start by educating people with the idea that we need our children together. I mean, I've had, half a dozen people in our own small community say, when are we going to start a youth group or a children's ministry, or, and I say, we're not going. Not that I'm going to do a youth Bible study this winter, but not as a replacement for our Sunday services, but as an addition, a supplement to what we do. I think that part of it is developing a conversation, the recognition, kind of like the sin talk. When you recognize you're a sinner, then you can accept Christ. When you recognize that we've screwed things up with agent stage ministry, then we can begin to. And here's the thing: it's such a new field. People ask me all the time, how do I do this? Honestly, I'm figuring it out the same as everyone else is. I ran an intergenerational VBS. It was run in the evening so adults could participate. We put a meal in it so that they didn't have to cook. We divided them up in intergenerational groups and we rotated them around different stations. I did it, intergenerational missions trips where the adults were originally chaperones, but then they had to be adult participants and they felt demoted. But by the end of it, they realized they did. No, you can't just go off into your room when the work's over the day. I expect you to participate and to do everything that the youth are doing because you're an adult participant, not a chaperone. It's about the community participating in these practices. But what the question then is, Karen, is what are those practices that we're participating in? And so if we're just playing fun and games with our young people, those are the practices they learn. If we're engaging them in theological discussion and Bible studies and hiker meals and the rituals of our Sunday morning services, that teaches them who they are, and then they develop and grow into a person with an anchored identity. And I hope for Judah's sake that, and I do believe he has an anchored identity, but that's my prayer for him. As he sees all these worldviews coming at him, he's not going to just take his Christian identity and put it under his bed in a lockbox. He's going to allow that to be something that he bounces ideas off of. And I think it's a challenging thing in our modern day society where there are so many views to buy into. But the hope is that in Proverbs 22:6, train up a child in the way they should go. When they're old, they won't depart from it. The interesting thing about that is when they're old, they won't depart from it. It doesn't mean there's not a little period of departation in the middle. So I know I'm have you over time. One more question. What were you going to say?
My grandchildren are in an intergenerational church.
Mm-hmm.
But my grandson, 19, is really tempted to get away from it. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to keep him in, but what's to prevent that?
There's nothing to prevent it, and honestly, it's a common thing than not. I mean, they say, and after 4 books now on this National Study of Research, National Study of Youth and Religion, what they've said is that that not only the theological vocabulary that they recognized or identified in kids as a signal of passing down faith actually comes from having theological discussions. So, in other words, in their home. So when they were able to talk about faith and talk about theology and talk about these things in their home, it became a commonplace in their life, and they never departed from it because it was so normative for who they were. So how do you answer, how do you balance that now for a kid who wants to go away? I mean, I think honestly, just loving them and allowing them to see your earnest faith. And then again, you trust that the Spirit of God is dwelling with them.
And he will come back eventually.
So, and you hope they will. But even Calvin says that just because someone was raised in the faith doesn't necessarily mean they'll remain in the faith. And that's where we can't control that. We can just love them for the best that we can. Last questions, anyone? I know that was a lot. Then you get it, Karen. Go for it.
You were talking about the churches where they separated the generations and had activities for them, and they didn't go to church. But in those churches that you're talking about, the adults were also given all kinds of opportunities, biblical tours, evenings of playing cards, whatever they did. So it was in them also. It wasn't that they had a good basis themselves.
I mean, the truth is, it started somewhere around your generation. It's just coming to a head now. I mean, your generation wanted to change the church, so you made a non-denominational sort of consumer-oriented church. That's why Willow Creek and Saddleback type churches thrived. Well, when my generation rejected that, we sort of went into a spin and didn't know where to go, and we were at least willing to stay. And my generation returned to church in our early 30s. You want to know why? Because that's when we were getting married, and that's when we were having children, and we wanted to we didn't know how to raise our children morally. A whole nother conversation, but something shifted around the 1950s to 2000 in the way we understand authority. We used to base our understanding of authority based on rationality. This is right or wrong, and sort of a system that held it together. Well, and it's when we stopped passing down some of those morals and it started becoming morally ambiguous, people started, and when you fragmented, parents working and kids not, and basically being entirely raised by the public schools, what happened was they didn't have an emotional connection with adults that were rational to help them make the decisions for their future. So the way they relied upon making decisions was what they had an aversion to. So young people say, I don't want to be that, so I'll be this. Not saying this is who I am, so this is who I'll be. I know that's a lot that I've just thrown at you. So we can go over some of it. We'll do another one next week, and I'll shape some of the smaller nuances that make it a little bit more interesting. I mean, there's all sorts of things. We can take you through architecture of how communities change. We'll go look at a house built in the 1930s and they have giant front porches. Why? Because people sat on their front porches and talked to their neighbors. Well, the boomer generation shifted that, and they said, you know what, let's take entryways and let's take patios in the back. Well, by the time the Gen Xers came along, they were like, you know what, I'm tired of patios. I want to be privacy fence, and I want a deck that wraps around the back. And so and that also is just globalization and our ability to import wood from the tropical forest of South America. And then and then you have, and it's furniture too. Look at the furniture made in the 1940s and 50s. They were heirloom pieces. My generation is IKEA.
That's right.
You can see the way we have privatized our world. In fact, Robert Putnam wrote a book called Bowling Alone. It's about the death of civil service and communal leagues that brought people together, and it's the image of one person bowling by themselves. We have made such an individualized society that I think it is the church's job to reclaim intergenerationality. It is the church's job, and that's why I love the fact that my son is involved in all sorts of forms of service in the church, and he has stronger relationships with many of you than he does with his own peers in the community, because you are the people he interacts with during the week on a regular basis. All right. Blessings as you.
Thank you.